Great to talk to you today, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak
Could
to
you give us an overview of what's happening in Israel at the moment with all this dissension that we're hearing about and the huge protests on the streets? What's your view of what's going on?
Well, yeah, first of all, what's happening is that the government is trying to introduce a quite significant reform package regarding the judicial system, which opponents of the package consider that if implemented, these proposals together will reduce the power and capacity of the court to oversee decisions of government to a degree that will threaten Israel's status as a democracy. And of course, supporters of the reform oppose that view and consider, by contrast, that it is essential to alter the current balance of power between judiciary and the legislature and executive in order to preserve democracy in Israel. So these feelings are running very high on this. And of course, there's very large demonstrations taking place. Unfortunately, at least in my estimation, what the demonstrations and this whole issue has teased out or has exposed are issues and schisms in the society which go far beyond actually the sort of sometimes quite dry and detailed discussion of judicial system. It's exposed differences between religious and secular Jewish Israelis, differences, I'm afraid, between Jews whose families came from Europe to Israel and those whose families came from North Africa and Western Asia. So divisions in the society that many people had hoped had begun to be healed, I think have been exposed as still being very much present in the society, and fault lines in the society, I think, have been, very much kind of exposed, by this process, which of course is by not any means finished. The Knesset, the Parliament, is currently in recess. It will reconvene in October. And then we understand the process of legislating these changes will commence once again, and the protests, I assume, will commence once again also. My own view, for what it's worth, as a citizen and as a concerned and worried citizen of Israel, actually, is that regardless of the content of the judicial reform and the arguments back and forth, and I'm somebody who has sympathy for the view there needs to be some reform of the system, I think the government should simply stop the process dead in its tracks now, because no matter how important one may think judicial reform may be, it is not more important than the unity of the country, and it's certainly not more important than the unity of the armed forces and the air force and their ability to continue operating. And these are now, to some degree, under threat by this process taking place.
Anthony Lowenstein has been travelling around New Zealand promoting his book, The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. He claims that Israel has become the foremost weapons and surveillance technology manufacturer because it's had the Palestinians to practice on. What do you think about that perspective?
Israeli defense industries are an important part of the Israeli economy, and that includes also various systems. And of course, Israel is a country that has been in conflict, unfortunately, since its inceptions, not by any means, as Anthony Lowenstein perhaps thinks, not by any means only in terms of the need, unfortunately, to police areas of the West Bank, but also, of course, against very powerful conventional forces that Israel has gained a reputation for standing up to quite effectively. As a result, I think there is a positive image regarding Israeli defense industries in many parts of the world, and people are keen to buy. This is something which I think is an industry in which many countries are involved. And frankly, I find it a little bit, let me be frank, I find it unsurprising that people who are unsympathetic to Israel will seek to kind of single Israel out, as though engaging in defense industries, when Israel does it, suddenly becomes some remarkably nefarious practice, whereas when, let's say, Australia, for example, does it, which of course it does, then it's just the run of the business of human affairs. So I think that, whilst it's an interesting subject, I would suspect that somebody who wants to portray Israel as being in some way uniquely wicked or uniquely negative because it has a defense industry and it engages in that, is somebody whose motivations should be examined quite closely, not only in the field of defense industries, but also perhaps in terms of their broader agenda.
Because this notion of using the Palestinians as a laboratory is a fairly cynical view.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's I would say it's more than cynical. I would say it has within it an element appears to have within it an element of venomous hostility, because, I don't recall, Britain, for example, where we're currently located, has also a flourishing defense industry. And British armed forces have been engaged in various missions in recent years, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. But it would be a rather strange framing, I think, if someone were to stand up and say, well, yes, clearly Britain has emerged as this cynical country that uses civilians as a laboratory for its defence industry. So this would be a very strange framing. In fact, I think when one puts it in that context, when one exchanges the word Israel for the word Britain, it becomes apparent just how strange this framing is. And I think what we're really seeing here is not something restricted to the discussion of defence industries. Rather, it is the common phenomenon of Israel being framed in a uniquely venomous and hostile way by people who are indeed venomously hostile to the country, irrespective actually of this or that Israeli action in this or that sector. So
would you label that anti-Semitism?
I'm not sure if it's anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a very big discussion, I would say, to say which is anti-Semitism. But certainly we can say that Israel, I very much subscribe to the view which says that Israel has become something like the Jew among the nations. That's to say that there is a certain parallel in the kind of sense that in the Western world and beyond it, for many years and many centuries, Jews found they simply could not get a fair hearing. It didn't really matter what they did. Whatever they did would be interpreted as being uniquely malicious, uniquely malignant, and uniquely deserving of condemnation. And I think we can see a very clear parallel between that sort of traditional treatment of the Jew and the way in which Israel today is singled out by the most astonishing double standards. For example, in the UN recently, the General Assembly found it right to condemn just one country for violations of women's rights, and it was not, Afghanistan under the Taliban or wherever else. It was, in fact, or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. It was Israel. So yeah, the most astonishing double standards are displayed.
For those who are not aware, why is that so astonishing? Why is Israel different to Saudi Arabia?
Oh, because Israel is a fully functioning democracy in which women play, thankfully, a very, very prominent role in a whole number of sectors. So, of course, I'm sure women don't have a 100% fair deal in Israel, sometimes they don't in Western countries, but, there's simply no comparison between Israel and a country like Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, where women are not permitted to attend school.
Sure. Now, I've just heard you bring a very interesting analysis of the Middle East, because you're a Middle East expert, not just on Israel, but the whole of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And you described the kind of conflicts throughout the Middle East, which were Sunni and non-Sunni, I believe. And then you explained how Israel fitted into that kind of frame of thinking very well, which was a different way for us in the West, at least, to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you just explain a little bit more about that framework?
Sure. Well, I just think that there's a common misconception in the way that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is framed in the West, in the sense that it's seen as something unique unto itself. Whereas actually, if you broaden the lens slightly and take a look at the Middle East, or what I would say the Levant, traditionally the Levant and what was Mesopotamia or now is Iraq, that area in which Israel is located, what you then find is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in fact just one of a whole number of conflicts that very much resemble one another, in which different groups based on ethnic or religious sectarian basis are in conflict with one another. So if you think of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then you go up to Lebanon and you look in the way in which Shia and Sunni Arabs and Christian Arabs also are in conflict there, across to Syria, where once again an Alawi dominated, which is a kind of a break-off from Shia Islam, an Alawi dominated government is in conflict with its largely Sunni Arab population. Or look at the conflict between Kurds and Turks a little bit further north, or a little bit further east, the conflict between Shia and Sunni Arabs in Iraq. Then what you actually see in that region, in our region, is a kind of patchwork of, I would say, ethnic or ethno-sectarian conflicts that are quite similar to one another. And this whole area, of course, until just over a century ago, was the area ruled over by the Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic Muslim-dominated empire. And in a certain sense, I see all these conflicts as conflicts of succession, in which the empire collapsed a century ago, and different population groups are still warring over the correct boundaries and correct forms of political association and organization in the area in question. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is quite unremarkable in that respect. It is another of these conflicts. Unfortunately, I think in the West, the reason why it's singled out and seen very differently, to be very frank, is because of the West's particular view of the Jew, because of the way that the Jew is never to be permitted to be just another human collectivity engaging in human activity. There is always something unique and something particular and something special. And that's why I think Israeli-Palestinian conflict is framed in this particular way, when actually, if one takes a look dispassionately, so to speak, one sees that this conflict is resemblant to many other conflicts in the locality.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.